morning, everybody, or maybe good afternoon or good evening or even good night, depending where you are. Welcome to Module 2, Content and Language Learning Activities in CLIL. Please take a moment to read the screen and look at the aims of our module. Okay, communication. As we know, we have 4 C's in CLIL: communication, content, cognition, and culture or community, as it's sometimes called. No one C is more important than the other. In fact, you might find that at times in the lesson, you seem to be focusing maybe on one C more than another. It all depends. What's really important, however, is that we give our students as many opportunities as possible to communicate during the lesson. For me, and many other educators in CLIL, communication is a thread which runs through all of our CLIL activities, whatever the teaching sequence. This has very big implications for TTT, or teacher talking time. As we mentioned in Module 1, mind-brain research shows that if the teacher always reads aloud from the whiteboard, the screen, or the course book, there's a real risk that the students don't engage with its content. Cognitively, it's a very low level of challenge. All you have to do is listen to me read aloud from a whiteboard or a book. As teachers, we're often used to being in control all the time, especially in big classes, especially in big teenage classes or big primary school classes, which means that it can be hard for us to let go. Handing over to the students and letting them do more of the work or more of the speaking can be a big challenge for the teacher, especially at first, because I think there is a feeling of losing control in the classroom sometimes for discipline reasons, for classroom management, and also because of noise levels. A lot of children talking at once can cause a lot of noise. And also a lot of children talking at once means that they might be talking different languages at once and maybe not our target language, which is English. However, we do know that research into translanguaging tells us now that if students want to use their native language, if they have a low level of English in a CLIL lesson, that's fine, as long as we push them towards using the structures of the language in English. So let's look at cognition now. Excuse me. How do we push our students in terms of cognition without pushing them too far? In CLIL classes, due to the big difference between the level of content and the actual level of English that our students have, there can be a danger of what we call cognitive overload. The students have to deal with too much information at once, in too many forms, and the demands of the task are often too complex. This can mean that only shallow learning takes place. The students are just memorizing words, definitions, and concepts, and they repeat them parrot-like. So although memorizing is an important lot stage, in fact, it's a key stage at the beginning, it has to have real meaning, or the students just will not retain the information. I'm sure as teachers, we've all done a similar thing when we were students, stayed up very, very late the night before an exam, drunk lots of black coffee, and in the morning passed an exam. However, are we able to retain have we retained any of that knowledge the following week or the following month? Probably not. Another important aspect of cognition in CLIL is the amount of time we give students to think about answers. Thinking generally is something we need to allow more time for. Remember, everything in CLIL takes a little bit longer. But please read this quote on the board by Professor Mary Budrow, an educator. Professor Mary Budrow did a lot of research into teacher waiting time, and it's very, very interesting. I think there's real food for thought here. As a teacher, it's very hard not to jump in and give the answer ourselves, especially when we have such constraints on our time. For example, 10 minutes left at the end of the lesson. We need to do X, Y, and Z. So we rush through our questioning process rather than giving the students time and checking that they understand concepts. So if I ask a student a concept checking question, like, for example, is the desert hot or cold? I don't give them enough time to answer. I pause for a second and then I just jump in and give them the answer. So what we need to do in CLIL is recognize that everything takes a little bit longer and allow for that. Okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z in the next 10 minutes, but do you know what? I'm just going to do X. Y and Z can wait for another day. There's time. Learning a language is a long process. The educator Ted Wragg was a pioneer in his research on questioning and answering in the classroom. Not specifically the CLIL classroom, but in general, the primary and the secondary classroom. I'm going to show you a very short video of Ted Wragg explaining his theory of questioning very briefly, because he explains it far more clearly than I do. Let's go. Before we start, however, if you find a pencil and a piece of paper, it would be really nice if, while you listen, you could just jot down 2 or 3 main takeaways, 2 or 3 main points that impress you, that you think, oh, this is surprising, this is interesting. Okay, thank you.
At this point of the course, please pause this video and go to the following link: bit.ly/Ted Wragg video, or use the QR code on the screen. You're going to watch a video about using questions in the classroom. When you finish the video, please return here and continue the course. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what your main takeaways from that are, but I find it fascinating. I have 3. My first takeaway number 1, is that I was shocked by the statistic of 4%. Only 4% of questions asked in secondary schools are higher order thinking skills questions. That really surprised me, because I imagine, even with my experience in teaching in secondary schools myself, I imagine that higher order thinking skills would be all over the place, that they would be questions that teachers are asking all the time, but apparently not. My second takeaway, is a very practical takeaway. It's about that lovely question: what will happen when the new motorway reaches our town? As soon as I heard that question, I thought 3 Ys. We start the lesson with a visible thinking routine, and we start the lesson with a big question. What will happen when the new motorway reaches our town? The first why, how will it affect me personally? Why does it matter to me personally? Maybe because I'll get to school on time. Or maybe I won't get to school on time. It depends. How is it important to the people around me? Well, my mum will be able to get to work quicker, and dad can visit grandma quicker, and we will all be able to visit the supermarket outside town. But how will that affect our local community negatively? Maybe the small shops will lose money and have to close, because everyone will go to the big supermarket because they'll use the new motorway. So we've got the personal aspect and the community aspect. And for me, fantastic. The third why, how would this affect society as a whole? How will it affect the country? How will it affect us globally? Really, really nice question. And I couldn't resist the chance to use that in a 3 Ys in my lesson. My third takeaway, and it's actually a very serious takeaway, is about 1 million questions. If a teacher asks 1 million questions in 15 years, and I've been teaching for 30 years, does that mean I've asked 30 does that mean I've asked 2 million questions? And if I teach for another 15 years, does that mean I will have asked 3 million questions in my teaching lifeline? What a thing to think about. Good learning starts with questions, not answers. A quote by Professor Guy Claxton, Professor of Education at Bristol University, and another educationalist who's interested in questions. Pause and wait. We need to ask follow-up questions. Yes, and tell me why you think this. What else? Explain to me how. We can't just accept a question. We have to probe and get the children to give us more information. So where do we start? Well, we start with our learning outcomes. We start in the lesson with what we want the students to learn. But we have to be very clear about that in CLIL. What do we want our students to learn? Is it appropriate that they learn it? And also, how does it connect to previous lessons and how does it lead to future ones? This is easier said than done. First of all, we have to think about our long-term objectives with CLIL. And our long-term objectives are to get from basic interpersonal communication skills to cognitive academic language proficiency. We're talking now about Jim Cummings' theory of BICS and CALP. BICS and CALP is the result of many years of academic theory about what children learn naturally and then what they need to learn. So, for example, BICS is basic interpersonal communication skills. What do the students need for everyday life in the class? They need to ask about the weather, they need to say please and thank you, they need to say hello and goodbye, they need to use the bathroom, they need to ask for material. They need to do this for everyday life in the classroom. Communication on a very basic level. Our aims, our main learning objectives, are to get the students from BICS to CALP. CALP is all about the academics. CALP is the leap from expressing basic concepts and needs in the classroom to actually understanding and being able to participate in a regular classroom. And by regular, we mean here a native speaker classroom. Most of Jim Cummings' research was made about ESL students, speakers of English as a second language. So these were students who lived in the country where the second language was actually experienced, where it wasn't taught, where it was the native language of speakers in the street and homes. So I'm going to show you a short video which can explain it much more simply than I can. So again, can you get a pencil and a paper? Because I'd really like you to write down your main takeaways from watching this video. Okay?
Hi, this is a TEL 410 introduction to Jim Cummings, BICS, and CALP. This is one part of a series of videos that supports language teaching and learning. Here, we will introduce Cummings in a simple way that meets the needs of this course. Jim Cummings is a professor of language and literacy development at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. His research has laid the foundation for the understanding that language is a part of cognitive development, not behavior. He is a strong advocate for bilingual and L2 learning as it improves the classroom environment. In 1979, Jim Cummings coined the acronyms BICS and CALP. These refer to processes that help teachers to understand a student's language fluency. But what is BICS and CALP? BICS is a person's basic interpersonal communicative skills. This is a measure of conversational fluency or social language. These communication skills are ones that are developed through everyday interactions with language, such as speaking with a friend, on the phone, or even sending a text. CALP stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, better known as academic language. This is language that uses vocabulary for a specific field of interest and is usually used in the classroom or workplace. This is a commonly known graph for BICS and CALP that helps to show the level of cognitive demands versus how abstract or concrete the language activity is. This graph is split into 4 quadrants. Quadrant A includes concrete and cognitively undemanding language activities, such as a face-to-face introduction, conversation, or a video call. Quadrant B is concrete and cognitively demanding. This includes activities such as a job interview or a class presentation. Quadrant C includes abstract and cognitively undemanding activities, such as a diary entry, a phone call, or a text message. Quadrant D is abstract yet cognitively demanding. This quadrant can include activities such as a standardized exam or a research paper. While the BICS and CALP dichotomy explains and advocates for bilingualism, when it comes to understanding language for pedagogical purposes, this dichotomy does not work out so well. In fact, it is actually problematic. Let's look at some English language learners in the classroom as an example. Some EL students have a highly developed BICS. This means that they seem to be fluent while speaking casually with their peers and teacher. However, when given an exam, a student may not perform well due to an underdeveloped CALP. Since each situation presents differing cognitive demands, and diverse students come with differing background relationships with English, BICS and CALP is not a one-size-fits-all theory. The quadrant lines can actually become blurred or change completely depending on the situation. For example, it is very possible for a high school student in an AP Spanish class to pass the AP exam with flying colors, since what they were tested on may not have been cognitively demanding for them. However, when the student actually visits a Spanish-speaking country, conversing with a native Spanish speaker may be amazingly demanding. As educators, we need to make sure that we are aware of our students' language abilities. Just because they are speaking fluently with their peers, it doesn't mean they don't need further language support. Being socially fluent is not the same as being able to use the language at the same academic level as their native English peers. Because academic language can be very specialized, it takes between 5 and 7 years to develop on par with native English speakers. This means that a student who begins learning English in the 2nd grade may not have a highly developed CALP until they reach high school. In contrast, social language usually takes between 6 months to 2 years to develop into fluency. Some ideas for helping EL students in your lessons are giving them a list of definitions or translations before your lesson so they can become more familiar with the lesson vocabulary, using images and drama during your lessons to provide multiple modalities for learning, and connecting the lesson to your EL's cultural background. However, you should avoid relying solely on best practices and strategies, and instead build new understandings and learning paths between your students' first and second language. This is often termed as translanguaging, which we will discuss later in another video. You should get to know your students personally and individually, along with their backgrounds and language needs, so that you can know how best to help them. This moves us beyond the simple quadrants of the BICS and CALP dichotomy. Cummins is a great advocate for ELs and bilingualism, since we still have many practices today that systematically lower the chances of our EL students graduating from high school or attending college. His theory gives educators another look at their students' development, which helps students experience success in the classroom. That's all for now. Be sure to check out our other theories.
What's really interesting, I think, is what Jim Cummings says about the time element. It takes between 5 and 7 years to get from BICS to become fluent in CALP. Remember, Jim Cummings' theory, most of his research was based on speakers of English as a foreign language. child immigrants in countries such as Canada, the UK, Australia, or the States. So their position is slightly different to the students we teach in the sense that they have a lot more exposure to the language. Our students have less exposure to the language. However, we do have the big advantage now of more exposure in terms of music, in terms of culture, in terms of access to the internet and authentic materials. And also we have a lot more bilingual education. English is not only taught for 2 hours a week in a lot of schools, it's taught for many more hours. So we are getting more and more hours in. So hopefully we're going to reduce the time limit. Okay, so what do we have to think about as a teacher? Any more takeaways from this? Translanguaging is really, really important, I think. Remember when we spoke in Module 1 about the difference between hard and soft CLIL and weak and strong CLIL? We've done away with those definitions now, and we think of CLIL more in terms of an approach to teaching language and content in context. So what we're trying to do here is think about translanguaging as a positive thing in the classroom. Before, in the hard CLIL method, none of the students' native language was taken into account. But now we recognise that bilingual education and also CLIL education can use this as a great advantage. Okay.